Hello, and welcome to another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. My name is Andrej Matišak, and I work as the Deputy Head of Foreign Desk in Slovak Daily Pravda, which, by the way, means truth, and it's not Russian Pravda. Elections in Hungary are not expected until April, but who is leading in the polls? Péter's Magyar's Tisza party or Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's Fidesz? To better understand the situation, I spoke with Daniel Hegedűs, the Regional Director for Central Europe at the German Marshall Fund. He writes and speaks extensively on populism and democratic backsliding in Central and Eastern Europe, and we discuss what Orbán might be willing to do to remain in power. Listen to our conversation. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Coffee. For the link, see also a description of this episode. And now, up to the new debate. Daniel, how do you read the polls in Hungary these days? In recent weeks, we have seen a couple of surveys, mainly by pollsters close to Fidesz, if I can say so, showing Prime Minister Viktor Orbán's party, Fidesz, ahead of Péter's Magyar's Tisza. Do you think this lead is real, or is it just Fidesz propaganda?
I think that our main takeaway from the polls should be, and if there is not a pivotal change happening, potentially we can stay with this until April, that everything is possible. There is something in the polls because even independent polling companies have registered actually a rise of Fidesz support, and the margin, the difference, so the scissor between the opposition party, who is still in a very comfortable lead, and Fidesz actually closing. Obviously, the polls published by organizations close to the governments you refer to are real media hits, but we even have had in the past, for example, government-friendly Nézőpont Viewpoint Institute publishing poll results, which has shown Fidesz to be in the lead. So I don't think that we in any way can trust those polling agencies. So they are more part of the communication and propaganda machine of the government than really professional pollsters. But it's a matter of fact that the dynamism of the Tisza campaign was hit by developments of the past moves. And it is on the one hand, really extraordinary amount of use of deepfakes, AI, and actually sheer propaganda and even negative propaganda by the government side, claiming that it was actually the failure of the opposition party Tisza, that their application, digital application, was hacked, and that personal data of more than 200,000 Hungarians were released, while actually the government is actively intimidating those people. They claimed that they leaked a potential government program of Tisza, which foresees very high tax burden, and even unimaginable taxes. So, for example, the taxation of pets and small kitties and dogs, while actually every serious research is revealing that it's a completely AI-written program and has nothing to do with the main opposition party. And just the idea of, a kitty tax is obviously smelling that it was designed actually for consumption in the digital space. But the reality is not necessarily reflected in a large extent in the political communication of the government side, because what we see is actually mainstreaming fake news and the fake as a main vehicle of political communication. On the other hand, especially against this background, Tisza is still a party and a movement with a very strictly controlled communication. And the lack of communication, the lack of detail, the lack of information about programmatic, in large extent also about the experience and just the ability of their candidates to really serve as politicians, this is in some way stirring suspicion in an undecided part of the electorate, whether it's really the right idea to vote for them. And they are just simply disoriented by the government's communication campaign that, oh my God, I thought that they are fighting corruptions, but if they want to tax kitties, then potentially I am reconsidering my preferences. And my nutshell would be that what we see here is really the application of the Russian disinformation strategy in the domestic space, that actually disorientation is the main purpose. So the government doesn't necessarily want to win voters with policies or not even with values anymore. It's simply the main message that if you vote for the opposition, then you will pay a kitty tax. And in some way, it really reflects that digital post-politics is actually the new reality in Hungary.
All what you just said, Daniel, is somehow dystopian, I would even say. And, the mainstreaming of the fake news, using the Russian tactics, AI, and stuff like this. So, maybe I will exaggerate a bit, but if Fidesz is willing to do all those things you just described, what else they might be willing to do? Could it go as far as directly manipulating the real election results? I know that's a different level, of course, but still, as I said, somehow sounds to me what you're describing as kind of dystopian.
It's a kind of dystopian, and please just allow me to change your logic. I think in order to be able to answer this question, we don't need to have insider information from Fidesz. Of course, people have knowledge potentially or have assumptions whether Fidesz is ready to cheat on the elections or not. I think if we are approaching the issue from a European perspective, from the perspective of European partners, in a strategic way, then obviously I think European partners need to include worst-case scenarios in their strategic planning. And I have been very vocal about this in the past and also in recent months, that if we take a look actually on the track record of Fidesz and the Orbán regime with elections, then the starting point is that the last free and fair elections used to happen in Hungary 15 years ago, in 2010. Since 2014, all elections has been unfair. The real question is not whether the elections will be fair, they won't. I fully agree with you. The real question is elections will be free, whether there will be such a significant amount of election day irregularities or other manipulation efforts that can significantly impact the election outcome. And here, if we take a look on the 2018 election, which was actually the election in the past 15 years with the highest election day irregularities, and the 2022 election, then we see that the real thing which is determining the amount of such irregularities is actually the opportunity structure and the political will to win at any price. In 2022, the amount of irregularities was lower because there was a full-scale OSCE ODIHR election observation mission, and because the Hungarian opposition, together with the civil society, was able to deploy 20,000 ballot counters that actually acted as election observers. If that won't be possible in 2026 on the part of the international community due to lacking support for a full-scale mission, or on the part of TISA, because even if they have the manpower, they refrain from actively cooperating with civil society and are potentially not be able to trade the appropriate amount of ballot counters and observers, then the opportunity structure will be domestically very supportive. It is a matter of fact that this is a make or break moment for the Orbán regime. They are more or less ready to do everything for the political survival. And the last thing we need to take into account that the international environment is much more enabling for a not free election in Hungary than used to be in the past, based not only on the national security strategy, but also on the past behavior of this US administration since January. Their interference into the German parliamentary elections, Polish, Romanian presidential elections, it's more or less clear that there will be some sort of interference into the Hungarian elections as well to support the survival of Prime Minister Orbán. I think the most likely development is that this support will be political, A, in the form of a potential Trump visit before the election, and B, that the United States will jump to recognize a victory of Prime Minister Orbán, even if there are significant concerns regarding the integrity of the elections. And then this is the starting point the European partners need to respond to. But overall, irrespectively whether we believe that there will be significant election day irregularities or not, the responsible approach by European partners is to be prepared for a worst-case scenario, because if that worst-case scenario kicks in and the EU will face its first non-democratic elections in a member state, that can have very far-reaching negative consequences for the democratic integrity of the European Union. And in such a case, it's better not to be caught by surprise.
The elections are expected to take place only in April or so, but the campaign already seems to be in full swing. Let's talk briefly about that. Let's start with Tisa. What is Péter Magyar's core campaign message to voters so far?
Péter Magyar core campaign messages really relate to bread and butter topics. And I think this is also the key of the success of his political communication until now. He was able to convincingly do where others, for various reasons, failed in the past on the opposition side, actually to forge a convincing narrative how corruption, how that systemic funneling of public resources into the pockets of oligarchs close to Fidesz are really impacting the living quality of everyday Hungarians. Through the desperate quality of public services, may that be healthcare, may that be public transportation, particularly the situation with the Hungarian rail service MÁV in recent years, but also education, and generally the lack of economic growth and economic performance, in which regard it's more or less clear that in spite of all of the success propaganda of the Hungarian governing party, Hungary practically lost the competition game to almost all of its neighbors. And it's now a widely quoted comparison that in 2004, when the country entered the European Union, it has had the second highest GDP per capita, only superseded by Czechia. And now it has one of the lowest in the whole European Union, and potentially only Bulgaria is in a worse situation in that regard. So all of these bread and butter economic performance, policy quality issues are central. And then obviously there is also an important dimension that shows the inhuman side of the power, how, for example, the Hungarian childcare system suffered, for example, the foster homes and child homes under the government of Fidesz, how child abuse, including sexual abuse, became widespread in these institutions, and how actually key political stakeholders might have been shielding those criminals from prosecution and investigation, not for years, but in some cases, even for a decade. And I think this, on the one hand, very human, on the other side, very inhuman dimension of the campaign was also a very important catalyst for the opposition movement, TISA, because it provided really such an emotional and highly motivational topic that was able to mobilize disappointment in the society against the government and in the support of Péter Magyar.
I'm not sure if you are aware of this, but many Slovak observers, including those who strongly prefer a change of government in Hungary, compare Péter Magyar to former Slovak Prime Minister Igor Matovič. Means they say Magyar is a conservative politician willing to use any PR stunt, has an oversized ego, and that cooperation with him is and will be quite difficult, or very difficult even. Do you think this is a fair description or not really, and why?
I think this is a half-baked comparison. I see and understand why this comparison is made, and especially with regard to the populism of both politicians, their conservative worldview, potentially their ego, and very centralized leadership style in the party. This comparison sits. However, where I see very fundamental differences is strategy and discipline. Péter Magyar is a highly conscious, strategic, and disciplined public speaker. And yes, he has a very, very centralized leadership over the party, but this party is actually delivering and functioning sufficiently and effectively under such highly centralized leadership. And I think this is exactly the opposite, which was the case with Matovič or the former Olano party, where actually this lack of effectively highly centralized aspiration, but the overwhelming wish to have it, combined with the absolutely unconscious, loose cannon and non-strategic communication of a former prime minister, was, at least in my reading, and I must emphasize this, that unfortunately I spend less time lately with analysis of Slovak politics that I would like to do. But I think in that regard, there are also very significant differences, both between the style, the personality, and also the efficiency of these two politicians.
So back to the campaign, what is Viktor Orbán's core message to voters so far?
If I would summarize this, potentially I would appear to be a bit unserious, but I think we could the best summarize this, that if you vote for Tisza, then you are voting for the Third World War, or pretty close. You are voting for the end of the world and the doom and the Untergang of the Hungarian state and society. You are voting for high taxes. You are voting for warmongering, and you are voting for a political alliance which will result by the control of the European institutions over Hungary, because the country will have a non-sovereign government, and sooner or later it will end up the country sending its sons as soldiers to the front of Ukraine to fight Russia. I fully agree that for foreign observers, this appears to be rather nonsensical, but I think this is really the narrative stage of the Hungarian public discourse now, particularly with a close look on the Hungarian government narrative.
And it seems it still works. No matter how we read the polls, we cannot say that, the Fidesz is totally collapsing. So is it still working? Am I right?
It is still working, and for some reason it's also not a surprise. Actually, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022 won the elections for Prime Minister Orbán even 4 years ago. And simply how emotionally loaded, how existential this question is, and how, due to the government propaganda, there is no, in even a halfway objective and fact-based discussion and debate in the Hungarian public about the security challenges to Europe, about the intentions of Russia and the costs of the Russia-leaning foreign policy of the Hungarian government, and also of its highly destructive EU policies. Against that background, this discussion can remain at such low emotional level, where actually the key messages of the Hungarian propaganda are resonating with a large part of the society. However, I also would like to flag or flash another opportunity, and it is that obviously the war and the warmongering is favoring Fidesz. Nonetheless, a peace settlement, if it happens until April, can also very much favor Fidesz, particularly if appears to be most likely from a current perspective, this peace settlement will be highly disadvantageous for Ukraine and will pretty much favor Russia. And actually those governments in the European Union who have always been very vocally critical towards actively supporting Ukraine and seeking a re-engagement with the Kremlin. So this will be a political piece of cake for Prime Minister Orbán, who in that moment will be able to state that, look, my strategy was right all the time. European politicians spent tens of billions of EU taxpayer money just to lose a war and end up in a situation where Europe is actually more dependent and exposed to the United States and Russia than it was potentially before, because they pursued a wrong policy. And at European level, this will be a very, very big challenge for the integrity of the European Union and European political elites. And in Hungary, this will be a God-given gift for Prime Minister Orbán in the election campaign.
Daniel, since Orbán heavily relies on anti-Ukrainian sentiment and promotes good relations with the Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, do you think Moscow will actively try to influence the elections in Fidesz's favor? You already mentioned that Fidesz is basically using the Moscow playbook. But do you think that Russia is willing to go even that far, that privy, getting into the elections directly?
Of course, Russian interference into democratic election processes in the EU is a permanent story. However, I don't think that given actually the strategic level factors that can interfere, like peace settlement and the extent of the impact of potential interference by the US administration. So I don't believe that the classical toolkit of Russian information manipulation, trolls, bots, fake accounts on social media can really make a difference. Of course, there are other venues, and we don't know, for example, which hacker group was in the background or is responsible for hacking the digital application of the opposition party TISA. But I think that, of course, business as usual interference will happen, but I don't think that if that interference remains at the past level, that in any way it can be influential. So even the Russians need to raise the stakes and actually the level of their ambitions and extent of their actions if they would like to make their mark on the election outcome, because otherwise I don't think that it will be in any way decisive.
And finally, do you expect Orbán will try to use partners like Czech Prime Minister Andrej Babiš and Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico in the campaign? Do Hungarian voters care about them?
Obviously, it might happen. And of course, Hungary will continue to hold the Visegrad 4 rotating presidency until July. So the opportunity is there to try to organize high-level meetings with the Czech and the Slovak Prime Minister. Potentially V4, due to the known animosities between the current Polish and Hungarian government, is not the best format to do so. But I don't think that, again, it will be in any way decisive in the campaign. It might show that Prime Minister Orbán has the international network, what every Hungarian knows that he has, but it's certainly not a game changer. What can be a game changer, and just with last words, we cannot exclude the scenario that still there will be a significant overhaul of the Hungarian electoral system until April, or in the worst case, that there can be a significant overhaul of the whole Hungarian constitutional system. Fidesz has the constitutional two-thirds majority for that. And if Prime Minister Orbán really perceives that there is no chance to win the elections, even with the deployment of or the use of irregularities, then he may opt for a very strange semi-presidential system where actually the powers of the new president might be even equal to the powers of the French president, but he will be elected not by the people, but by the Hungarian parliament. And then obviously the new president of Hungary will be the current prime minister. Obviously, these are crisis scenarios for Fidesz and for the Hungarian society that would clearly send a message that even Fidesz sees that they would lose, and it would really, I think, destabilize Hungary socially. But we may take into account those developments because a lot of signs are actually demonstrating on the part of Fidesz that they are actively preparing in the background, for example, the legislative body of those scenarios.
This was another episode of my podcast, The Global Agora. Subscribe, listen on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the other platforms. If you enjoy what I do, please support me on Ko-fi. For the link, see also the description of this episode. Thank you for listening and stay tuned.